the winter of 1745, something happened in the Mohawk Valley of New York that colonial authorities buried so deep it took nearly 3 centuries for the truth to surface. 17 families, 43 men, women and children, all dead in a series of brutal raids that should never have happened. The attacks followed a pattern so precise, so calculated, that survivors whispered of an invisible puppet master orchestrating the carnage from the shadows. What they didn't know was that their puppet master was 11 years old, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had turned genocide into a family business. The name Jonas Crichton appears in exactly 3 colonial documents from that winter, each time marked with a special notation that historians have only recently deciphered. It means sealed by gubernatorial order. Before we continue with the story of the boy who turned war into profit and death into an art form, I need you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Because this dark chapter of American history touches every corner of our nation's bloody birth. The truth about Jonas Crichton didn't emerge from dusty archives or forgotten letters. It came from the dying confession of a Mohawk elder in 1823, recorded by a missionary who immediately sealed the document and begged his superiors to never let it see daylight. The Mohawk Valley in 1745 stretched like an open wound across central New York, a corridor of scattered settlements clinging to the edges of civilization. King George's War raged between the French and British, turning the American frontier into a chessboard where pawns were measured in human lives. The valley's inhabitants, Dutch patroons, German immigrants, Scots-Irish frontiersmen and English merchants lived in constant fear of French allied war parties sweeping down from Canada. Fort Hunter stood as the region's primary trading post, a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a 12-foot palisade. Here, in a large stone house that served as both residence and warehouse, lived Hamish Crichton, one of the most successful arms dealers on the colonial frontier. Crichton had emigrated from Glasgow in 1738, bringing with him a keen understanding of European weapon manufacturing and an even keener sense for profit in times of chaos. The Crichton household was a microcosm of frontier complexity. Hamish employed 2 Mohawk interpreters, a French trapper who'd switched allegiances, and a former indentured servant from Virginia who kept the books. His wife, Margaret, had died giving birth to their only child, Jonas, in 1734. The boy grew up surrounded by the conversations of war, the clatter of muskets being cleaned, and the careful negotiations that meant the difference between peace and bloodshed. Jonas Crichton was no ordinary child. By age 7, he spoke fluent English, Dutch, and Mohawk. His father's business required constant communication with various factions, and the boy had proven invaluable as a translator and messenger. Standing barely 4 feet tall, with sharp grey eyes and an unsettling stillness about him, Jonas moved through the complex world of frontier politics like a ghost observing a play. The winter of 1744 had been particularly harsh, and spring brought news that chilled the blood of every valley resident. French forces under the command of Captain Paul Marin had been spotted moving south from Lake Champlain. More disturbing were reports of Abenaki and Huron war parties being supplied with fresh British weapons that seemed suspiciously similar to those in Hamish Crichton's inventory. In May of 1745, Hamish received a visitor that would change everything. Captain Edmund Stockwell of the New York Colonial Militia arrived at Fort Hunter with disturbing news. Someone was playing both sides of the conflict, selling weapons to hostile tribes while simultaneously arming colonial militias. The practice was not just treason. It was a death sentence for innocent families caught in the crossfire. The morning of June 14, 1745, dawned clear and unnaturally quiet. Jonas Crichton sat in his father's study, carefully copying inventory lists in his precise adult-like handwriting. Through the window, he could see 2 Mohawk warriors approaching the trading post. He recognized them immediately. Thayandanegea's brother, Karoniaktati, and a younger warrior named Konwatsitsiayeni. Both men carried themselves with the tension of those bearing important news. Hamish was inspecting a shipment of muskets that had arrived from Albany the previous day. The weapons were of exceptional quality, British Brown Bess muskets with modifications that made them lighter and more accurate than standard military issue. Jonas watched his father's hands move over the weapons with the reverence of a craftsman appreciating fine work. When Karoniaktati entered the study, his face was grim. "The French captain sends word," he said in heavily accented English. "His warriors need more of the fire sticks, the ones with the silver bands around the stock." He gestured toward the window, where a small group of Huron warriors waited in the shadows of the tree line. Jonas felt something stir in his chest, not fear, but excitement. He understood what was happening in a way that even his father didn't quite grasp. These weren't just business transactions, they were pieces of a vast game where information was more valuable than gunpowder, and the right word whispered to the right person could tip the balance of power across hundreds of square miles. "Tell the French captain his warriors will have their weapons," Hamish replied carefully. "But the price has increased. British patrols have made transport more dangerous." After the Mohawk left, Jonas approached his father with the careful manner he'd perfected over years of observation. "Papa, what if the British knew the French were getting weapons with silver stock bands?" Hamish looked at his son sharply. "That's not information for children, Jonas." "But if someone told them," the boy continued with innocent curiosity, "wouldn't they want to know where those weapons came from? Wouldn't they pay for such information?" The idea that formed in Hamish's mind wasn't his own. It was planted there by his 11-year-old son with the precision of a surgeon inserting a scalpel. Within the week, Hamish had made contact with British intelligence officers offering to serve as a double agent. What he didn't realize was that Jonas had already begun his own correspondence, writing letters in 3 languages to various military commanders, traders, and tribal leaders throughout the region. Jonas's first independent operation began with an overheard conversation between 2 Dutch traders discussing the Vanderburg family farm. Peter Vanderburg had emigrated from New Amsterdam in 1739, establishing a prosperous homestead along the Mohawk River, where he raised cattle and grew wheat for the Albany market. His wife, Grietje, was known throughout the valley for her skill with medicinal herbs, often trading her remedies for goods the family couldn't produce themselves. The Vanderburgs represented exactly what Jonas was looking for. A family prosperous enough to matter, but isolated enough to be vulnerable. More importantly, Peter had recently begun trading directly with French agents, bypassing established intermediaries like Hamish Crichton, a business decision that had reduced the Crichton family's profits by nearly 15%. On June 28th, Jonas visited the Vanderburg farm under the pretense of delivering a message from his father about medicine for a fictional sick trader. While Grietje prepared a packet of willow bark tea, Jonas engaged Peter in conversation about recent French activity in the region. The boy's questions seemed innocent, a child's natural curiosity about the exciting world of adult business. "The French captain who buys Papa's muskets," Jonas said with wide-eyed interest. "He told Papa that some farmers are helping French soldiers hide from British patrols. Papa says that's very dangerous for those families if the British find out." Peter's face tightened with concern. "What farmers? Did the captain mention names?" "I wasn't supposed to hear," Jonas replied with perfect childlike guilt. "But I think he said something about Dutch families near the river. Papa got very angry and told him that would bring trouble to innocent people." The seed was planted with surgical precision. Jonas had given Peter Vanderburg just enough information to create fear without providing specific details that could be verified. The implication was clear. French agents were involving local families in military operations without their knowledge or consent, and British authorities were becoming suspicious of Dutch settlers' loyalties. 3 days later, Peter Vanderburg appeared at Fort Hunter, demanding to speak with British representatives about his family's loyalty to the Crown. The meeting, arranged through Hamish Crichton's contacts, put the Vanderbergs on British intelligence lists as a family worth monitoring, exactly where Jonas wanted them. The boy's next move demonstrated a sophistication that would have impressed professional spies. Through his network of tribal contacts, Jonas learned that a small Huron war party was planning to raid isolated farms along the Mohawk River, targeting families believed to be cooperating with British forces. The raids were intended as warnings rather than massacres, quick strikes designed to discourage colonial cooperation with British military operations. Jonas saw an opportunity to turn a warning into a tragedy. On July 8th, he visited the Huron camp with information he claimed to have overheard from British scouts. The Vanderberg farm, he told the war party leader in fluent Mohawk, was being used as a meeting place for British officers and colonial militia commanders. The family was actively providing intelligence about French and tribal movements, information that had already led to the capture of 2 French scouts and the deaths of 3 Huron warriors. The information was carefully crafted to transform the planned warning raid into a revenge killing. Jonas provided specific details about the farm's layout, the family's daily routines, and the weapons they supposedly kept for British visitors. Most importantly, he told the war party that British officers would be meeting at the farm on July 12th, a fabrication that would guarantee maximum violence when no officers appeared. Simultaneously, Jonas was working the British angle with equal precision. Through his father's intelligence contacts, he passed along information about increased Huron activity near Dutch settlements. The intelligence suggested that French agents were pressuring Dutch families to provide support for upcoming military operations, using threats against their property and livestock to ensure cooperation. The boy's masterstroke was a forged letter, supposedly intercepted from French agents, that specifically mentioned the Vanderberg farm as a staging area for operations against British positions. The letter, written in Jonas's careful hand using French phrases he'd learned from traders, provided just enough authentic detail to pass casual inspection while containing enough suspicious elements to justify immediate British intervention. On the morning of July 12th, a British patrol led by Sergeant Timothy Hewlett approached the Vanderberg farm to investigate reports of French collaboration. At almost the same moment, 12 Huron warriors were surrounding the property, preparing to attack what they believed to be a gathering of British officers and their Dutch collaborators. The massacre that followed lasted less than an hour. Peter Vanderberg died trying to protect his family from attackers whose language he couldn't understand and whose presence he couldn't explain. Gretchen was killed while attempting to reach their children, who were hiding in the root cellar. The British patrol, arriving to find the farm under attack, engaged the Huron warriors in a firefight that left 5 soldiers and 7 warriors dead. When the smoke cleared, the Vanderberg farm was a smoking ruin. An entire family had been destroyed, along with nearly a dozen soldiers and warriors, all because an 11-year-old boy had whispered the right lies to the right people at precisely the right time. Jonas observed the aftermath of the Vanderberg massacre with the detached fascination of a scientist studying experimental results. The boy had learned valuable lessons about timing, information flow, and the psychological triggers that could transform routine military operations into bloodbaths. The most important discovery was that people's existing fears and suspicions made them eager to believe information that confirmed their worst expectations. Peter Vanderberg had been worried about French involvement with Dutch settlers, so he'd readily accepted Jonas's implications about his neighbors' loyalties. The Huron war party had been angry about British cooperation with colonial families, making them receptive to stories about Dutch collaboration. British officers had been concerned about French infiltration of Dutch settlements, causing them to treat Jonas's forged letter as credible intelligence. Each group had heard exactly what they expected to hear, and their predictable reactions had created a perfect storm of violence that served Jonas's ultimate goal: maximizing demand for his father's weapons while eliminating business competition. In the week following the Vanderberg massacre, Hamish Crichton sold 37 muskets to local Dutch families terrified of Indian attacks, 24 pistols to British officers concerned about settler loyalty, and a substantial quantity of gunpowder to French agents seeking to arm their tribal allies for revenge operations. The destruction of one family had generated enough fear and suspicion to fuel weapon sales across 3 different factions. Jonas recorded these transactions in his private journal with the same meticulous attention he gave to his father's official inventory lists. But the boy's records included additional details that would have horrified anyone who discovered them. Precise calculations of the relationship between casualties and profits, detailed observations about the psychological vulnerabilities of different ethnic and military groups, and careful notes about the optimal timing for introducing false intelligence into complex political situations. By mid-July, Jonas Creighton had transformed from an unusually intelligent child into something far more dangerous. A master manipulator who understood that information could be more deadly than gunpowder, and that the right lie told to the right person could kill more effectively than any weapon his father's shop could provide. By late June, Jonas Creighton had become the invisible center of a communication network that stretched from the Hudson River to Lake Ontario. Using his father's established connections and his own remarkable linguistic abilities, the boy began orchestrating a series of misunderstandings that would escalate minor skirmishes into full-scale atrocities. His method was elegantly simple: selective information sharing. When British scouts reported French troop movements, Jonas would ensure that certain details were omitted or exaggerated in the reports that reached colonial commanders. When Mohawk war parties planned raids on isolated farmsteads, Jonas would provide just enough warning to some settlements, while ensuring others remained completely unaware of approaching danger. The first test came on July 2nd. Jonas learned from a Huron messenger that a small war party planned to attack the Henderson Farm, an isolated homestead 15 miles north of Fort Hunter. The family consisted of Thomas Henderson, his wife Sarah, and their 3 young children. They were vulnerable, defenseless, and, most importantly from Jonas's perspective, their deaths would generate enough outrage to justify a massive increase in weapon sales to local militias. But Jonas's plan was more sophisticated than simple murder. 3 days before the planned attack, he sent word to Thomas Henderson through a Dutch trader, warning him that French agents had been spotted in the area and suggesting that the family might want to visit relatives in Albany for a few weeks. The message was carefully crafted to sound like friendly advice rather than a specific warning. Henderson, a proud Scots-Irish farmer who'd fought in previous conflicts, responded exactly as Jonas had calculated. Rather than flee, he sent word to neighboring farms, organizing a small defensive force. By the night of July 5th, 12 armed men had gathered at the Henderson farm, turning what should have been a simple raid into a potential massacre. Jonas's next move revealed the full depth of his calculation. On the morning of the attack, he visited the Huron camp and spoke with the war party leader in fluent Mohawk, passing along information he claimed to have overheard from British scouts. The farm, he told them, was defended by only old men and boys. Colonial militia had been withdrawn to defend Albany from a French advance. The weapons they'd purchased from his father, Jonas assured them, would make quick work of any resistance. The battle at Henderson Farm lasted 3 hours. When it ended, 7 colonists lay dead, including Thomas Henderson and 2 of his children. 5 Huron warriors had also been killed, including the war party leader who'd trusted a child's intelligence. The survivors on both sides retreated with stories of treachery and superior enemy preparation that made no logical sense. Within a week, Hamish Creighton had sold 47 muskets to newly formed colonial militias, 62 pounds of gunpowder to French agents, and a case of pistols to Mohawk warriors seeking revenge for their fallen comrades. The boy who orchestrated the entire sequence sat in his father's study, carefully recording each transaction in his precise handwriting, calculating profits that were measured in both coins and corpses. By August of 1745, Jonas had expanded his operations beyond simple information manipulation. The boy had recognized that his father's trading post was just one node in a vast commercial network that stretched from Montreal to Albany, connecting French agents, British officials, tribal representatives, and independent merchants in a web of relationships that could be exploited for maximum profit. Through careful observation and strategic conversations, Jonas mapped this network with the precision of a military cartographer. He learned that Isaac Klock, a German immigrant who operated a rival trading post near the Noses settlement, was experiencing financial difficulties due to increased French military activity. Abraham Yates, a Dutch merchant from Schenectady, was seeking new suppliers for British Army contracts. Samuel Wells, an English trader based in Albany, had been asking questions about French weapon purchases that suggested possible intelligence connections. Each of these merchants represented both an opportunity and a threat. Jonas understood that controlling information flow between them could determine not just his family's profits, but the entire balance of power in the regional arms trade. The boy began crafting a series of operations designed to eliminate competitors while expanding his father's market share through carefully orchestrated violence. His first target was Isaac Klock, whose German Lutheran background made him naturally suspicious of French Catholic influences, while his financial desperation made him vulnerable to manipulation. Jonas learned from Mohawk contacts that Klock had been approached by French agents seeking to establish a weapons cache near his trading post, an offer that the struggling merchant had reluctantly accepted. The boy saw an opportunity to destroy a competitor while simultaneously creating new demand for weapons. Through his father's British intelligence contacts, Jonas arranged for information about Klock's French connections to reach colonial authorities. But the intelligence he provided was carefully modified to suggest that Klock was voluntarily collaborating with enemy agents rather than being coerced by financial necessity. Simultaneously, Jonas was feeding different information to French contacts, suggesting that Klock was planning to betray French operations to British authorities in exchange for colonial protection and financial support. The boy's genius lay in making both accusations technically true while ensuring that neither side understood the full context of Klock's situation. The destruction of Isaac Klock's trading operation began with a pre-dawn raid by British colonial militia on August 23rd. The soldiers, acting on intelligence that suggested Klock was storing weapons for French military operations, discovered exactly what Jonas had predicted: a cache of muskets and gunpowder that Klock couldn't explain without admitting to French connections that would confirm his apparent treasonous activities. Before Klock could be formally arrested, a Huron war party attacked the militia patrol, apparently attempting to recover weapons that French agents claimed had been stolen by a traitorous German merchant. The firefight that followed destroyed Klock's trading post, killed 6 colonial soldiers and 4 Huron warriors, and left Isaac Klock himself dead from wounds received during the crossfire. Within a month, Hamish Crichton had acquired most of Klock's former trade routes and customer relationships, expanding his business operations to include German settlements that had previously been outside his commercial reach. The eliminated competition allowed the Crichtons to raise prices while reducing the quality of service, knowing that desperate customers had few alternatives in the increasingly violent frontier environment. Jonas's next operation targeted the supply chain that connected frontier trading posts with major commercial centers like Albany and New York City. The boy had learned that weapons shipments followed predictable routes and schedules, making them vulnerable to coordinated attacks that could appear accidental while serving specific business purposes. Samuel Wells, the Albany-based trader who'd been asking suspicious questions about French weapon purchases, represented both a threat to the Crichton family's security and an opportunity to demonstrate Jonas's growing influence over regional military operations. Through careful investigation, Jonas discovered that Wells was indeed working with British intelligence services, gathering information about French military supply operations for use in planning future raids and ambushes. The boy's response was characteristically sophisticated. Rather than simply eliminating Wells, Jonas decided to use the merchant's intelligence connections to orchestrate a series of attacks that would simultaneously destroy French military supplies, eliminate British intelligence assets, and create new opportunities for Crichton family profit. Working through his network of tribal contacts, Jonas provided French agents with detailed intelligence about British supply convoys traveling between Albany and frontier trading posts. The information was accurate enough to enable successful attacks while being timed to ensure maximum disruption of British military operations. But Jonas's intelligence came with subtle modifications that would guarantee French victories while creating long-term strategic disadvantages. The boy told French commanders that British convoys were lightly defended and carrying primarily commercial goods rather than military supplies. This intelligence encouraged aggressive attacks that would capture valuable weapons and ammunition. What Jonas didn't mention was that these particular convoys were being used to transport Samuel Wells and other British intelligence operatives to frontier meetings with colonial agents. The ambush of the September 14th convoy achieved exactly what Jonas had planned. French forces, expecting to capture a lightly defended commercial shipment, instead found themselves attacking a military escort protecting British intelligence personnel. The resulting battle lasted 4 hours and ended with the destruction of both the convoy and most of the French raiding party. Samuel Wells died in the fighting, along with 2 other British agents whose intelligence operations had posed potential threats to Jonas's activities. But the French forces also suffered casualties that significantly reduced their capacity for future military operations in the region. Most importantly, from Jonas's perspective, the attack created immediate demand for replacement weapons and supplies from both British and French sources. The boy's most ambitious operation during this period involved manipulating the delicate relationship between British colonial authorities and their Oneida allies. The Oneida had remained generally loyal to British interests throughout the escalating conflict, providing scouts and warriors for operations against French positions while resisting French attempts to recruit them for anti-British campaigns. Jonas recognized that this loyalty represented both a strategic asset for British forces and a potential vulnerability that could be exploited for maximum profit. If the Oneida could be convinced that British authorities were planning to betray their alliance, their reaction would create immediate opportunities for French military advances while generating massive demand for weapons from panicked colonial settlements. The operation began with Jonas carefully studying Oneida political structures and identifying key decision-makers within the tribal council. Through his Mohawk contacts, he learned that Shenandoah, an influential Oneida war chief, had been expressing private concerns about British long-term intentions regarding tribal lands and sovereignty. These concerns provided Jonas with the psychological pressure points he needed to destabilize the British Oneida alliance. Using information gathered from British intelligence contacts, Jonas learned about planned military operations that could be presented to Oneida leaders as evidence of British treachery. A proposed raid on French positions near Lake Ontario required coordination with tribal allies, but the operational details included provisions for establishing permanent British military posts in traditional Oneida territory. Jonas saw an opportunity to use accurate information in a false context to achieve devastating results. Through carefully orchestrated conversations with Oneida representatives, he suggested that the proposed military posts were not temporary strategic positions, but permanent installations designed to control tribal movements and limit their traditional hunting and trading activities. The boy's manipulation was subtle and sophisticated. Rather than directly accusing British authorities of planning to betray their Oneida allies, Jonas simply asked innocent questions about the long-term implications of increased British military presence in Oneida territory. His childlike curiosity made these questions seem natural while planting seeds of suspicion that would grow into full-blown paranoia under the right circumstances. Simultaneously, Jonas was feeding complementary intelligence to British contacts, suggesting that French agents had been successful in recruiting Oneida warriors for operations against colonial settlements. This intelligence was technically accurate. French agents had indeed approached Oneida leaders, but Jonas's reports exaggerated both the scope of French recruitment efforts and the likelihood of Oneida cooperation. The collision between these two deception campaigns occurred during a crucial meeting between British officers and Oneida representatives on October 3rd. Captain Edmund Stockwell, acting on Jonas's intelligence about French recruitment, approached the meeting with suspicion and demands for stronger demonstrations of Oneida loyalty. Shenandoah, influenced by Jonas's suggestions about British territorial ambitions, interpreted Stockwell's demands as confirmation of planned betrayal. The breakdown of British-Oneida negotiations had immediate military consequences. Oneida warriors, who had been scheduled to participate in British operations against French positions instead, remained neutral, leaving colonial forces dangerously exposed during subsequent campaigns. More seriously, the diplomatic crisis encouraged French agents to intensify their recruitment efforts among other tribal groups, creating new threats that British forces were unprepared to handle. Jonas observed these developments with satisfaction that bordered on scientific fascination. The boy had successfully manipulated two separate political entities into mutual suspicion and hostility, using nothing more than carefully timed questions and selectively shared information. The resulting military complications would generate weapon sales, create new intelligence-gathering opportunities, and eliminate potential threats to his family's commercial dominance. But Jonas's greatest achievement was something that even he didn't fully recognize at the time. He had demonstrated that information warfare could be more effective than conventional military operations in destabilizing enemy alliances and creating strategic advantages. The 11-year-old had essentially invented techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized by intelligence professionals for another 2 centuries. As summer turned to autumn, Jonas's operations became increasingly sophisticated. He'd learned that the key to successful manipulation wasn't just providing false information, it was providing true information to the wrong people at the wrong times. A real French troop movement reported to colonial militia a day late could result in an ambush. Accurate intelligence about British supply convoys shared with hostile tribes could trigger retaliatory raids that would kill dozens. The boy's greatest innovation was what he privately called the echo method. Jonas would overhear or engineer a piece of intelligence, then carefully modify it as it passed through his network of contacts. By the time information reached its final destination, it bore only a passing resemblance to the original facts, but each modification served Jonas's ultimate goal: maximizing conflict and, therefore, weapon sales. On September 18th, Jonas learned that Captain Stockwell was planning a major offensive against French positions near Lake George. The operation involved coordinating attacks with Oneida allies while preventing Mohawk warriors from joining French forces. It was exactly the type of complex military planning that offered multiple opportunities for profitable sabotage. Jonas began by visiting his friend Tekakwitha, a young Mohawk woman who served as an interpreter for various tribal councils. He shared with her his concerns about British plans to establish permanent forts on traditional Mohawk hunting grounds, information that was technically accurate but presented in a context that made it sound like an immediate threat rather than a long-term possibility. Tekakwitha, trusting the boy who'd grown up among her people and spoken their language since childhood, shared this intelligence with her uncle, a respected war chief named Canon Warohare. Within days, Canon Warohare was organizing Mohawk support for French forces, support that Captain Stockwell was counting on not happening. Simultaneously, Jonas was feeding different information to British contacts. Through his father's business correspondence, he let slip that French forces had received detailed intelligence about British troop movements, suggesting a spy in colonial ranks. This information, technically true since Jonas himself was providing intelligence to French agents, created paranoia and mistrust that hampered British military effectiveness. The battle near Lake George was a catastrophe for both sides. British forces, expecting Oneida support that never materialized and facing unexpected Mohawk resistance, lost 37 men in a day-long fight that accomplished nothing. French casualties were equally severe, and the mutual slaughter accomplished exactly what Jonas had intended. Both sides desperately needed new weapons, ammunition, and supplies. In the week following the Lake George disaster, Hamish Crichton processed the largest weapon orders of his career. British agents purchased everything he had in stock and placed orders for additional shipments from Albany and New York City. French representatives, operating through Huron intermediaries, bought gunpowder, shot, and maintenance supplies. Various tribal factions acquired pistols, knives, and specialized ammunition for different types of warfare. Jonas watched the transactions with satisfaction that bordered on scientific fascination. He'd created a perfect system. Conflict generated demand, demand generated profit, and profit provided the resources to create more conflict. Each death was both a tragedy and a business opportunity. Each military disaster a chance to sell solutions to the problems he'd helped create. October had brought the first harsh frosts to the Mohawk Valley, and with them came intelligence that would provide Jonas Crichton with his greatest opportunity for orchestrated destruction. Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel's supply convoy represented more than just another French military operation. It was the convergence point where Jonas could bring together months of careful manipulation in one devastating crescendo of violence. The boys' preparation for what would become the Deer Creek Massacre began with a detailed study of military logistics and communication systems. Jonas had learned that successful operations required not just the manipulation of information, but the precise timing of its release to ensure maximum destructive potential. Like a composer arranging a symphony of death, he began orchestrating the movements of three separate military forces toward a single, inevitable collision. His first challenge was understanding the French convoy's actual mission and composition. Through his network of tribal contacts, Jonas learned that Captain Taffanel was transporting not just routine supplies, but a substantial payroll intended for French forces throughout the region, along with specialized weapons and ammunition for upcoming winter operations. This intelligence provided Jonas with the foundation for the elaborate deceptions he would construct around the convoy's true nature. The boys' second challenge was more complex, creating believable but false intelligence that would motivate British and tribal forces to converge on the convoy's location at precisely the right moment. This required not just understanding military procedures, but anticipating the psychological responses of individual commanders to different types of threats and opportunities. Jonas's manipulation of British intelligence began with Captain Edmund Stockwell, whose suspicions about colonial loyalty had been carefully cultivated through previous operations. The boy had learned that Stockwell was under pressure from his superiors to demonstrate results against French operations, making him particularly receptive to intelligence that promised significant tactical victories. Through his father's intelligence contacts, Jonas provided Stockwell with a series of reports that gradually built a compelling but false picture of the French convoy's importance. The first report, delivered in mid-October, suggested that French forces were planning major operations against colonial settlements, requiring substantial financial resources and specialized equipment. The second report, timed to arrive just as British scouts were beginning to track French movements, indicated that a high-value target was moving through the region carrying resources essential to French winter campaigns. The boy's genius lay in combining accurate details with strategic omissions and modifications. The French convoy was indeed carrying valuable supplies. Jonas's intelligence was technically correct, but his report suggested that the convoy was lightly defended and carrying a payroll chest worth far more than its actual contents, while omitting crucial information about the escort's size and military capabilities. More importantly, Jonas timed the release of this intelligence to coincide with other intelligence suggesting that French agents were planning coordinated attacks on British positions throughout the region. This created a psychological context where attacking the convoy appeared to be a defensive necessity rather than an opportunistic raid, making British commanders more likely to commit substantial forces to the operation. Jonas's manipulation of tribal forces required even greater sophistication, as he needed to present the same convoy as both a threat requiring military response and an opportunity requiring protection. The boy had learned that different tribal groups responded to different psychological triggers, allowing him to craft customized deceptions for each audience. For the Mohawk war party led by Karonhiak, Jonas presented the convoy as a peaceful trading expedition carrying winter supplies promised to tribal families as compensation for losses suffered in recent conflicts. This intelligence transformed a military target into a humanitarian mission that required protection from British aggression. The boy's presentation of this information was masterfully crafted. Rather than simply lying about the convoy's nature, Jonas selectively emphasized certain aspects of its mission while minimizing others. The convoy was indeed carrying supplies that could benefit tribal communities, trade goods, and materials that French agents routinely used to maintain tribal alliances. Jonas simply exaggerated the humanitarian aspects while minimizing the military components. More deviously, Jonas provided Mohawk leaders with intelligence about British plans to attack peaceful trading expeditions, intelligence that was technically accurate but presented without the context that would explain British motivations. Colonial forces were indeed planning to intercept French convoys, but their target was military supplies rather than humanitarian aid. For other tribal groups, Jonas crafted different versions of the same basic deception. Huron warriors learned that British forces were planning to steal French gifts intended for tribal families. Abenaki scouts were told that colonial militia were preparing to attack neutral trading parties as part of a broader campaign against tribal sovereignty. Each group received intelligence that appealed to their specific concerns and grievances, while being carefully timed to ensure that their responses would converge on the convoy's location at precisely the moment when maximum conflict was inevitable. Jonas's most sophisticated manipulation involved the French convoy itself. The boy recognized that Captain Taffanel's decisions about routes, timing, and defensive preparations could determine whether the planned convergence resulted in a minor skirmish or a major disaster. By providing French commanders with carefully crafted intelligence about British and tribal movements, Jonas could influence these decisions in ways that would maximize casualties on all sides. Through Henri Dubois, the French trader who served as Jonas's primary contact with French military operations, the boy provided Captain Taffanel with intelligence about British troop movements that was accurate enough to be credible while being timed to encourage tactically disastrous decisions. Jonas reported that large British forces were moving toward French positions near Lake George, creating pressure for rapid completion of the convoy's mission. This intelligence encouraged Taffanel to accelerate his schedule and reduce the size of his escort, believing that British attention was focused elsewhere. Simultaneously, Jonas provided French commanders with intelligence about tribal movements that suggested strong native support for French operations in the region. This intelligence encouraged Taffanel to expect friendly reception from tribal forces he might encounter, while being unaware that some of these same forces had been convinced that his convoy posed a threat to their communities. The boy's manipulation of French intelligence was particularly cruel because it exploited Captain Taffanel's genuine concern for his men's safety. By suggesting that the greatest threats lay in directions away from the convoy's actual route, Jonas encouraged tactical decisions that would place French forces in maximum danger while believing they were taking prudent defensive measures. By November 20th, Jonas had successfully manipulated 3 separate military forces into believing that their converging movements were necessary responses to legitimate threats and opportunities. British forces under Lieutenant Colonel William Johnson were preparing to attack what they believed was a lightly defended but high-value French target. Mohawk warriors led by Karonhiak were mobilizing to protect what they understood to be a peaceful trading expedition carrying supplies for their families. Captain Taffanel's convoy was proceeding along a route that would bring them to Deer Creek at precisely the moment when these conflicting objectives would create inevitable violence. The boy spent the final days before the massacre in a state of heightened anticipation that he would later describe as the most exhilarating experience of his young life. Jonas had created a situation where experienced military commanders and veteran warriors would destroy each other through their own tactical competence, each group's success in achieving their perceived objectives guaranteed to result in catastrophic failure for everyone involved. On the evening of November 22nd, Jonas made his final preparations for observing the results of months of careful manipulation. The boy positioned himself at a location overlooking Deer Creek, where he could witness the convergence of forces he had orchestrated while remaining safely distant from the violence that would follow. As he watched the first French scouts establish their positions along the creek, Jonas felt a sense of godlike satisfaction that would remain unmatched throughout his brief but bloody career. Tomorrow would bring the culmination of his greatest achievement. Proof that an 11-year-old boy armed with nothing more than carefully chosen words could orchestrate military disasters that would kill dozens of experienced soldiers and warriors. As autumn deepened into winter, Jonas Crichton's appetite for manipulation had grown beyond mere profit. The 11-year-old had discovered something more intoxicating than money: the godlike power to determine who lived and who died with nothing more than carefully placed words. His masterpiece began with intelligence about a French supply convoy traveling south from Montreal. Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel was leading 40 soldiers and a baggage train loaded with winter supplies for French forts throughout the region. The convoy represented a legitimate military target, but Jonas saw it as something more: an opportunity to orchestrate the most devastating misunderstanding of his brief but bloody career. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Mohawk Valley intensifies. If this story's giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the tale of Jonas Crichton. The boy's plan required precise timing and the coordination of multiple military forces. Through his father's contacts, Jonas ensured that British intelligence learned about the French convoy, but the information they received indicated that Captain Taffanel was traveling with only 20 soldiers and carrying a payroll chest worth thousands of pounds. This false intelligence virtually guaranteed that British forces would attempt an ambush. Simultaneously, Jonas was working a different angle with tribal contacts. He visited Karonhiaktati with urgent news. British forces were planning a surprise attack on a peaceful trading expedition. The French convoy, Jonas explained, contained gifts and trade goods intended for Mohawk families as compensation for losses suffered in recent battles. If the British succeeded in their ambush, these essential winter supplies would be stolen, leaving many families to face the harsh months ahead without adequate resources. The third element of Jonas's plan was the most diabolical. Through a French trader named Henri Dubois, Jonas passed along information about British troop movements. A large colonial force, he reported, was planning to attack the Mohawk castle at Canajoharie, using intelligence provided by Oneida allies. This attack was supposedly scheduled to coincide with the convoy ambush, creating a coordinated assault on French and Allied indigenous positions. None of this information was entirely false. That was the genius of Jonas's method. British forces were indeed planning to intercept the French convoy, though not for the reasons Jonas had suggested to his tribal contacts. Some British commanders had discussed potential operations against hostile settlements, though no specific plans existed for attacking Canajoharie. French forces were moving through the region, though their mission was routine resupply rather than military aggression. By combining true facts with false context and selective omissions, Jonas created a situation where every faction believed they were responding to legitimate threats. The result was a three-way battle that began at dawn on November 23rd and ended with such carnage that survivors on all sides later claimed they'd witnessed the work of demons. The convergence happened at a ford across Deer Creek, 12 miles northwest of Fort Hunter. Captain Taffanel's convoy arrived first, making camp on the eastern bank, while scouts checked the surrounding forest for signs of British patrols. The French had no idea that Jonas's intelligence had drawn two separate enemy forces toward their position. British forces under Lieutenant Colonel William Johnson approached from the south, expecting to ambush a small French patrol carrying a payroll chest. Johnson commanded 60 colonial militia and 20 Oneida warriors, all convinced they were striking a blow that would significantly damage French operations in the region. The Mohawk war party, led by Caronhiac-Tartier, approached from the west, believing they were protecting a peaceful trading expedition from British aggression. 43 warriors had volunteered for what they understood to be a defensive mission to safeguard winter supplies for their families. At approximately 6:30 a.m., as morning mist rose from Deer Creek, the first shot shattered the November silence. A British scout, spotting movement in the French camp, fired the opening shot of what would become known as the Deer Creek Massacre, though official records would later describe it as a minor skirmish with limited casualties. What followed defied every convention of 18th century warfare. French soldiers, under attack from an unexpectedly large British force, formed defensive positions and returned fire with disciplined volleys. British militia, finding themselves facing regular French troops rather than the lightly defended convoy they'd expected, pressed their attack with desperate courage. Oneida warriors, caught between competing loyalties and confused by the presence of Mohawk fighters apparently allied with the French, attempted to avoid combat while protecting their British allies. The Mohawk war party, arriving to find their peaceful trading convoy under attack, launched a flanking assault on British positions, believing they were saving French friends from colonial aggression. In the chaos that followed, warriors who'd been allies for generations found themselves exchanging musket fire across a battlefield that none of them fully understood. The battle raged for 6 hours. When the gunpowder smoke finally cleared, 31 French soldiers lay dead, including Captain Taffanel. British casualties numbered 28, with Lieutenant Colonel Johnson among the fallen. 17 Mohawk warriors had been killed, along with 9 Oneida fighters who died trying to protect their British allies from their own cousins. But the true horror of Deer Creek wasn't the battle itself. It was what happened afterward. Survivors on all sides retreated with stories that made no rational sense. French soldiers reported being attacked by overwhelming British forces that seemed to know exactly where the convoy would be. British militia described a French trap that had somehow anticipated their ambush. Mohawk survivors spoke of betrayal and treachery, while Oneida warriors wondered how their longtime allies had turned against them without warning. In his study at Fort Hunter, Jonas Crichton recorded the battle's aftermath with the same careful attention he gave to his father's inventory lists. 85 dead. 7 different weapon orders totaling more than 300 muskets. Diplomatic negotiations that would require additional armed escorts and security measures. Each corpse at Deer Creek had generated multiple business opportunities. The Deer Creek massacre created problems that even Jonas hadn't anticipated. With so many dead on all sides, colonial authorities could no longer dismiss the increasing violence as normal frontier warfare. Governor George Clinton in New York City ordered a formal investigation, dispatching Major Samuel Wells to determine how such a catastrophic misunderstanding had occurred. Major Wells was a veteran of European conflicts who understood military intelligence and the importance of accurate information in preventing unnecessary casualties. His investigation began with a simple question. How had 3 separate military forces converged on the same location at the same time, each believing they were responding to legitimate threats? The answer led Wells directly to Fort Hunter and the arms-dealing operation that had supplied weapons to all parties involved in the massacre. Hamish Creighton, nervous about the investigation but unaware of his son's activities, cooperated fully with military authorities. He provided records of all weapon sales, correspondence with various military commanders, and detailed accounts of his intelligence-gathering activities on behalf of British interests. But Major Wells was a thorough investigator. He noticed discrepancies in the timeline of information flow, intelligence that seemed to reach different parties at suspiciously convenient intervals. More disturbing were the subtle variations in apparently identical pieces of information, modifications so slight that they could only have been made by someone with intimate knowledge of all parties involved. The investigation might have ended with routine findings of confusion in the fog of war, if not for a chance encounter that revealed the true architect of the Deer Creek disaster. On December 15th, while interviewing tribal leaders at Fort Hunter, Major Wells observed Jonas Crichton translating a conversation between Mohawk representatives and colonial officials. What struck Wells wasn't the boy's remarkable linguistic ability. Child interpreters were common on the frontier. It was the subtle way Jonas modified certain phrases, making minor adjustments that changed the context of statements without altering their basic meaning. A Mohawk complaint about soldiers taking food became warriors stealing supplies in translation. A reference to seeking peace was rendered as demanding compensation. Wells, fluent in Mohawk from his own frontier service, realized he was watching a master manipulator at work. But the manipulator was a child who shouldn't have possessed either the knowledge or the sophistication to orchestrate complex military deceptions. That evening, Major Wells requested a private meeting with Jonas Crichton. The conversation that followed, recorded in Wells's confidential report to Governor Clinton, revealed the full scope of an 11-year-old's war crimes. Jonas, perhaps recognizing that his game had reached its end, spoke with the same careful precision he'd used in orchestrating months of bloodshed. He explained his methods matter-of-factly, describing the modification and selective distribution of intelligence as a business strategy rather than mass murder. "Information is like gunpowder," Jonas told the major. "A little bit in the right place can move mountains. Too much all at once just makes noise." The boy outlined his network of contacts, his techniques for manipulating translations and timing, and his calculations regarding the relationship between conflict intensity and weapon sales. He spoke of dead soldiers and warriors as market indicators, of grieving families as demand generators, and of the Deer Creek massacre as his most successful operation. What horrified Major Wells wasn't just the scope of Jonas's crimes, but the complete absence of remorse in the child's demeanor. Jonas had orchestrated the deaths of more than 80 people over a 6-month period, and he discussed these achievements with the pride of a craftsman describing fine work. The confession revealed one final, devastating detail. Jonas's activities hadn't been motivated by simple greed or even family loyalty. The boy had discovered that he possessed an almost supernatural ability to predict and manipulate human behavior on a massive scale. Each successful manipulation had fed an addiction to power that grew stronger with every death he orchestrated. "I wanted to see if I could make them dance," Jonas explained to Major Wells. "All of them. The French, the British, the Mohawk, the Oneida. I wanted to see if words could be stronger than armies." Major Wells faced an impossible situation. Jonas Crichton's crimes were undeniable, but prosecuting an 11-year-old for orchestrating military disasters would create problems far beyond the boy's individual guilt. The revelation that a child had manipulated colonial authorities, French military commanders, and tribal leaders into a series of unnecessary battles would shatter confidence in frontier intelligence operations. More importantly, Jonas's confession revealed security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by genuine enemy agents. The boy's methods demonstrated how easily information could be weaponized by someone with the right knowledge and contacts. Publishing details of his techniques would essentially provide a manual for future intelligence operations. After consulting with Governor Clinton, Major Wells made a decision that would hide the truth about Jonas Crichton for nearly 3 centuries. The official report on the Deer Creek massacre attributed the disaster to communication failures and unfortunate timing. Jonas's role was classified under gubernatorial seal, with access restricted to senior military commanders and colonial administrators. The boy himself presented a different problem. Jonas couldn't be prosecuted without revealing his crimes, but he also couldn't be allowed to continue his activities. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Jonas Crichton would disappear. On January 12, 1746, official records show that Jonas Crichton died of fever during a harsh winter outbreak that claimed several lives in the Mohawk Valley. A small funeral was held at Fort Hunter, attended by his father and a few family friends. The boy was supposedly buried in the fort cemetery, though no grave marker was ever placed. In reality, Jonas had been transferred to a secure facility in Virginia, where colonial authorities hoped to study his unusual abilities while keeping him away from sensitive military information. The arrangement was temporary, intended to last only until better solutions could be developed. But Jonas Crichton wasn't interested in colonial authorities' plans for his future. The last confirmed sighting of Jonas Crichton occurred on March 3, 1746, at a secure house near Williamsburg, where colonial authorities had placed him under what they called protective custody. The boy had spent 2 months being interviewed by various officials who hoped to understand how an 11-year-old had orchestrated such sophisticated intelligence operations. Jonas had cooperated with these interviews, providing detailed explanations of his methods and insights into the psychological vulnerabilities he'd exploited. But his handlers noticed disturbing changes in the boy's behavior. He'd begun asking detailed questions about his interviewers' backgrounds, their families, and their official responsibilities. Several officials reported feeling that they were being studied rather than conducting studies. On the night of March 3rd, Jonas simply vanished. His room was found empty, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. The boy had somehow bypassed multiple guards and security measures without triggering any alarms or leaving any trace of his departure. The search for Jonas Crichton continued for months, involving colonial militia units across 3 colonies. But the boy, who'd demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to manipulate information networks, had seemingly evaporated into the vast wilderness of 18th century America. Some investigators theorized that Jonas had been killed by French agents seeking revenge for the Deer Creek massacre. Others suggested that Mohawk warriors had finally discovered his role in orchestrating their losses and had taken appropriate action. A few darker theories proposed that Jonas had found new patrons, perhaps Spanish agents or hostile tribes, who were willing to employ his unique talents. But the most disturbing possibility, noted in Major Wells's private correspondence, was that Jonas Crichton had simply returned to what he did best, manipulating conflicts from the shadows, orchestrating battles and massacres with nothing more than carefully chosen words whispered to the right people at the right times. The official silence surrounding Jonas Crichton's crimes lasted for 77 years. In 1823, a Mohawk elder named Karonhiaktati, brother of the war chief who died at Deer Creek, made a deathbed confession to Methodist missionary Samuel Kirkland. The old warrior, tormented by decades of guilt over his role in the massacre, revealed the truth about the child who'd manipulated his people into unnecessary war. Kirkland's transcript of this confession, sealed in church archives until 1968, provided the first detailed account of Jonas's methods and the true scope of his influence. The document revealed that tribal elders had suspected manipulation for years after Deer Creek, but had been unable to identify its source until long after Jonas had disappeared. More disturbing were Karonhiaktati's final words, recorded by Kirkland with obvious reluctance. The boy who spoke like water and struck like lightning, he did not die. I have seen his shadow moving through other wars, other battles. The evil that small hands can do does not die with the hands that did it. Modern historians remain divided about Jonas Crichton's ultimate fate. Some argue that an 11-year-old, no matter how intelligent, couldn't have survived alone in 18th century wilderness. Others point to unexplained intelligence failures and suspicious coincidences in subsequent frontier conflicts, suggesting that Jonas's techniques continued to influence American military disasters for decades. The most comprehensive study, published by Columbia University in 1987, identified 17 separate incidents between 1746 and 1763 that showed characteristics consistent with Jonas's methods: selective information sharing, modified translations, and the manipulation of timing to maximize casualties on all sides. While no direct evidence links these incidents to Jonas himself, the pattern suggests that his techniques either survived through disciples or were independently discovered by others who understood the profit potential of manufactured conflict. What we know with certainty is that the winter of 1745 marked a turning point in frontier warfare. The battles that followed showed increasing sophistication in intelligence manipulation, suggesting that someone had learned from Jonas's innovations and was applying those lessons on an even larger scale. The boy who turned genocide into a business model may have vanished from history, but his legacy lived on in every misunderstanding that turned neighbors into enemies and every coincidence that put enemies in the same place at the same time with just enough misinformation to guarantee bloodshed. This mystery shows us how easily information can be weaponized by those who understand human nature and the mechanics of conflict. Jonas Crichton's story reminds us that the most dangerous enemies are often those we never see coming, especially when they're hiding in plain sight, speaking our language and claiming to serve our interests. What do you think of this story? Do you believe a child could really orchestrate such sophisticated military manipulations? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what happened to Jonas after he disappeared. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's bloody frontier and want more horror stories from our nation's hidden history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another terrifying truth that official records tried to bury forever.